The gun looked wrong the moment you saw it in profile. Squat, neat, almost apologetic. A short, blunt barrel balanced on a compact carriage. A shield barely big enough to hide a man's head. Wheels the size of a bicycle, more than a field gun. In an age when weapons were measured by how loudly they declared themselves, the QF 2-pounder looked as if it had been designed to avoid attention. And that, in its way, was the point. In the early 1930s, the British Army watched a new kind of battlefield come into being. First World War lessons lingered in doctrine and training rooms, but tanks, still young, noisy, and unevenly armored, were already beginning to reshape what war would look like. The War Office wanted a defensive weapon that infantry could haul, dig in, and point at an approaching armored fist. The specifications were modest, something lighter and more mobile than the big field guns, accurate enough to punch holes in an enemy's armor at the ranges infantry most often encountered them, and fast to bring into action. Out of Woolwich and Vickers Armstrong's design rooms came a small gun, chambered for a 40mm round. The British designation QF-2PDR is itself a reminder of the period's language. Guns named not by millimeters, but by the weight of the projectile they fired. 2 pounds, small and neat. The engineers who refined it in 1934 gave it a quick, flat trajectory and a relatively high rate of fire for an anti-tank piece. It could be towed, unlimbered, and fired again in moments. It could be lifted by a handful of men and slipped into a trench or behind a stony outcrop. It could be mounted, with improvised adaptations, on the back of a truck for fast, aggressive use, a manner of warfare that would be all too necessary on the open sands of North Africa. Yet for all its practical virtues, the 2-pounder was born into skepticism. Doctrine moves slowly, habits harder. Between the wars, British thinking still leaned toward static defense and the implicit belief that tanks would be supported by air and heavier guns when they mattered. In the textbooks, in staff colleges and tea rooms, the idea that a small bored gun could halt an armored charge read almost quaint. Officers who had fought in the mud of 1916 or the mechanized cavalry encounters of 1918 found it hard to place faith in something so diminutive. The interwar years also supplied an unflattering theater of image. Military pageants and recruitment films demanded spectacle, and the 2-pounders supplied none. It had no impressive silhouette to parade at review grounds. Journalists who visited proving grounds returned with color plates of the latest tanks, with photographs of majestic 6-inch naval guns mounted on improvised carriages. The little anti-tank piece attracted only footnote commentary. In barracks, it gained nicknames that, if affectionate, were not flattering. The door knocker, the biscuit box gun. Men who aspired to serve in armored squadrons or on dreadnoughts rarely volunteered to become gunners of something so obviously modest. Yet the gun's conservatory life belied a quiet engineering truth. Its designers had succeeded in making a tool that fit precisely into the real geometry of close combat. The 40mm AP, armor-piercing, round had an excellent sectional density for its weight. At the ranges most encounters took place in the late 1930s, 100 to 500 yards in rolling country, shorter in broken ground, the 2-pounder could punch through the armor of many contemporary tanks' sides and turrets. Importantly, it could be produced in numbers. The wartime economy rewarded parts that were simple to machine and inexpensive to stamp. The first operational batteries were distributed to territorial units and to the new anti-tank companies that the British Army was painfully learning to value. Training doctrine emphasized speed of deployment. Dig a shallow pit, lay out the firing stops, and create a kill zone that directed enemy armor into the gunner's arc. Mobility was also a doctrine in waiting. Creative officers began experimenting, place the gun on the flatbed of a truck, and use speed, surprise, and a narrow window of exposure to accept the risks of mounting such a weapon in the open. The improvised portée mounting, Literally placing an anti-tank gun on a vehicle for transport and emergency firing was crude, undignified, but it demonstrated one of the two-pounder's greatest virtues: adaptability. Still, the gun's fate might have been marginal had a different war arrived. What changed everything was not a sudden revelation about metallurgy, but the geography of a fight. When the Second World War expanded into the deserts of North Africa, the contours that had seemed irrelevant in training grounds became decisive. The scrubby open expanses around Tobruk and the coastal approaches presented long sight lines, interrupted by a surprisingly small number of ridges and tracks. Tanks that dominated in Poland or France, Rommel's Panzers included, relied on momentum, flanking, and speed. But they also had to close those tracks and ride up the same rises that divided the desert plains into manageable approaches. In those places, visibility was brutal and simple. A cannon that could be tucked low in a shallow dip and fire repeatedly into the tank's vulnerable sides was worth 100 theorists' arguments. The two-pounder, light and rapid, could be hidden in a fold of ground, masked with scrap and burlap, and then brought to bear in a flurry of rounds at the precise moment a Panzer's flank presented itself. Where heavier guns needed time to move and emplaced machine guns could not traverse quickly enough, the little gun could be moved, re-aimed, and reloaded with astonishing speed. Its crew could deliver 22 aimed rounds in a minute, a rhythm that mattered when every heartbeat counted. It was also, paradoxically, a product of austerity. Between the wars, Britain had constrained its defense budgets. What it could afford most readily was efficient production and reliable logistics. The two-pounder fit that bill. It would not appear on magazine covers or in parliamentary debates as glamour. But in the hands of soldiers who learned its quirks, men who learned to hold their fire until the range was right, to angle the gun at the turret ring, to use the landscape as an ally, it promised something else: survivability. By 1940, the modest anti-tank piece had moved from the margins of doctrine to the center of some commanders' thinking. Not because the generals had suddenly changed their minds, but because the war had set the stage where a small, mobile, and accurate tool could change the calculus of advance. Designs would evolve, calibers would grow, and the two-pounder's day would not last forever. But in the lean, furious years before Panzer armor thickened and new guns arrived, the little weapon that no one wanted was learning how to make men stop and rethink the word toy. In the sand-whipped proving grounds of the desert, between drums of water and piles of camouflage netting, the two-pounder waited for its trial. It had no fanfare, no brass band accompanied its arrival. But when the first scouting tanks drove over a rise and met a rain of small, angry explosions into their thin sides, the debate in staff rooms about its usefulness would be resolved not by pamphlet, but by steel.
The desert was not empty. It only looked that way to those who didn't know where to look. Beneath the endless sand and the broken ridges of North Africa lay old wadis, limestone folds and scraps of stone that could hide a man, a truck, or even a gun if you knew how to use them. By the spring of 1941, the men of the British Commonwealth, British regulars, Australians, and New Zealanders had learned the lesson the hard way. They were the remnants of an army pushed to the edge of the map. In February, a name began to spread among the troops: Rommel, the Desert Fox. His Africa Corps, fresh from victories in Europe, swept across Cyrenaica with a speed and audacity no one expected. His panzers moved like the tide, outflanking every fixed defense, cutting every line of retreat. In just a few weeks, the British had been driven back toward Egypt. Only one fortress remained: Tobruk. It was a lonely port city surrounded by barren ground and stone ridges, defended by a mix of British gunners, Australian infantry, and a handful of tanks so old they were better described as relics than weapons. What they had instead, in surprising numbers, were small, boxy anti-tank guns, the QF two-pounders. They were supposed to be temporary stopgap weapons, But in Tobruk, they would become the backbone of the defense. Every day, the sun came up like a furnace door opening. The wind carried dust so fine it could blind you, and the heat rose from the rocks until even metal seemed to sweat. The soldiers dug their guns into the ridges around Tobruk, low, narrow trenches with a field of fire just wide enough to cover the flat approaches where Rommel's tanks would have to come. The two-pounders were small enough to hide behind a single mound of stone or a burned-out truck. The Australians, veterans of the outback who knew how to make the land lie for them, camouflaged the guns with burlap, sandbags, and even old tarpaulins cut from tents. From the air, they looked like nothing more than shadows. Each crew was 4 men, a gunner, loader, spotter, and commander. They lived beside their gun, ate beside it, slept beside it, cleaned it like a ritual. They knew its voice, the sharp metallic crack of the 40-millimeter round leaving the barrel. They knew how to time their shots so that the flash was masked by the rising dust, how to wait for the tank to close the distance before firing. The weapon's design lent itself to ambush. At 500 yards, the two-pounder could punch through the side armor of a Panzer III. At 300 yards, even the thicker hull of a Panzer IV was vulnerable. The trick was surviving long enough to get that close. On April 11, 1941, the first major attack on Tobruk began. Rommel's tanks came in from the west, gray hulls gleaming like beasts under the rising sun, advancing in perfect formation. From a distance, they looked invincible, the embodiment of German efficiency. Panzer III mediums, Panzer IV supports, and armored cars in the lead. Behind them came trucks full of infantry, dust boiling up behind every tread. Inside the fortress, the defenders held their breath. Artillery opened first, 25-pounders firing over open sights, shells shrieking across the desert. Then, as the tanks closed, the two-pounders came alive. Their first salvo caught the German advance by surprise. To the panzer crews, the initial clang of impact sounded like stones hitting armor, no threat at all. But when the second round hit at the same spot, the steel split. Flames leapt from the turret ring. Another tank lurched to a stop, its crew spilling out. The desert exploded into gunfire. A German officer watching through binoculars later wrote, "We thought at first they had new heavy guns, but then we found the wreckage, holes drilled by 40-millimeter shells. We had underestimated them." From that day on, the Afrika Korps learned to fear the invisible sting of the door knocker. The Australians began using the gun in a new way, not just static defense, but mobility. They mounted two-pounders on the backs of Bedford trucks, creating makeshift anti-tank vehicles known as portée. The trucks would race forward, fire a few shots, then vanish behind the next ridge before the Panzers could return fire. It was reckless, suicidal, and terrifyingly effective. One corporal described it. "You'd drive until you could see their dust, swing the gun around and start firing before the wheels stopped again, then pray the bloody engine starts again before they spot you." The German response was immediate and brutal. Stukas, the dreaded Ju-87 dive bombers, screamed down from the sky, dropping bombs so close the concussion threw men from their guns. Tanks rolled forward under cover of smoke, but the little British and Australian gun crews held their ground. When the dust cleared, the ridges around Tobruk were littered with wrecked panzer hulls, and the two-pounders stood blackened but unbroken. The weapon that had once been dismissed as too small had found its perfect war. The desert, for all its cruelty, gave it everything it needed: long lines of fire, concealment in the ridges, and quick escape routes for its crews. By May 1, 1941, the garrison at Tobruk had become a legend. Newspapers in London called them the Rats of Tobruk, a name the soldiers adopted with pride. Their fortress was little more than a ring of trenches, a few minefields, and hundreds of small guns, yet it stopped Rommel cold for 8 months. Captured German officers were astonished. One prisoner asked his guard in disbelief, "That little gun, it's only 40 millimeters?" The guard grinned, 40 mil, that's all we need." The two-pounder was not a miracle weapon. It could not pierce the front armor of a Panzer IV, It had no high-explosive shells for soft targets. Its crews suffered under the same heat and hunger as every other man in Tobruk. But it had one virtue that no one could deny. It never failed. It fired cleanly, quickly, again and again until either it or its crew was destroyed. And in the spring of 1941, that reliability was enough to halt the Desert Fox himself. Rommel in his diary noted with irritation, "The British anti-tank defense is unexpectedly tenacious. Their small guns, clever positioning, infuriating." He called them the gnats of the desert, always stinging, always disappearing. For the men who served them, those gnats were heroes. In the deep red sunsets of North Africa, as the wind died and the sand cooled, gunners sat beside their scorched barrels, cleaning and re-greasing the breeches, readying the next day's ambush. They didn't know it yet, but their small guns had already written one of the great chapters of the Desert War, a story not of overwhelming power, but of courage in miniature. The little gun that no one wanted had just stopped the most feared tanks in the world.
The siege began like a thunderstorm and settled into a nightmare that refused to end. From April to December 1941, the fortress of Tobruk stood as an island of defiance in an ocean of sand. Around it, the Afrika Korps prowled in circles, tanks, trucks, artillery, and Stuka bombers, searching for a weakness that would never come. Inside its battered perimeter, a garrison of British, Australian, Polish, and Indian troops endured bombardment, heat, disease, and hunger. And among them, holding the thin red line of defense, were the gun crews, the men of the QF 2-pounder. To the outside world, the defense of Tobruk became a symbol of British stubbornness. To the men inside, it was a test of survival, measured in inches and heartbeats. Every dawn began the same way. The horizon turned gray, then gold, then white-hot. The desert shimmered like water, and with the light came the sound, the metallic grind of tank tracks, faint at first, then swelling into a steady roar. Rommel's Panzers were coming again. Inside the gun pits, the crews were already awake. Their shirts were stiff with salt, their lips cracked from thirst. They had been up half the night repairing the breech springs, digging the sand away from the gun trails and setting their sights. Each 2-pounder was hidden beneath nets or sheets of torn camouflage, its barrel wrapped in burlap against the sun's glare. The gunners could hear the engines long before they could see them. Dust clouds on the western horizon, a sure sign of another German push. "Hold your fire," the sergeant said quietly. "Wait for them to close." The 2-pounder wasn't designed for long-range duels. Its power came from patience and precision. The gunners let the tanks approach to within 500 yards, sometimes less. Through the shimmering air, the shapes of Panzer III and Panzer IV emerged like ships through fog. The first shots rang out, the sharp, flat bark of the 40mm gun. One shell clanged off a Panzer's glasses plate, the next hit the turret seam and burst through. The tank erupted in a geyser of smoke. The crew of the 2-pounder reloaded, fired again and again. 22 rounds a minute, a metallic rhythm against the desert's heartbeat. Within moments, German formation broke apart. Tanks slewed sideways, smoke pouring from hatches, infantry scattered into the hollows, and the dust boiled into chaos. For the gunners, every battle was a brutal dance. They fired until the barrel glowed, then hauled the gun back by hand, dragging it to a new position before the inevitable counterstrike came. German 88mm guns, the terror of the desert, returned fire with thunderous precision. One direct hit could vaporize a 2-pounder crew. Many times it did. Private Bill Osborne, an Australian gunner, later recalled, "When you fired, you became a target. You had 10, maybe 15 seconds to get out or get hit. We used to say, fire twice, move once, pray always." The battlefield became a mosaic of small duels, each gun crew fighting its own private war against steel giants. By May, the garrison was fully encircled. Food and ammunition came only by sea, ferried in under cover of night by Royal Navy destroyers dodging Luftwaffe bombers. The men in Tobruk joked bitterly that they lived on bully beef, sand, and 2-pounder cartridges. But morale never collapsed. The Australians, who formed the backbone of the defense, adopted the nickname Rats of Tobruk. German propaganda had meant it as an insult, rats living in holes. But the defenders wore it like armor. One night, after a fierce attack, an Australian battery commander painted a rat on the shield of his 2-pounder, gnawing at a swastika. The image spread across the lines. By June, rats adorned helmets, trucks, and gun barrels. The soldiers said, "If Rommel wants us out, he'll have to smoke us out." The Desert Fox never managed it. Tobruk's ridges turned into killing grounds. Each approach was pre-sighted with multiple 2-pounders, overlapping fields of fire. German tank commanders, confident in their armor, learned to dread those invisible guns. They called them Die kleinen Geschütze, the little cannons, and respected their bite. In one engagement near the Al-Adem Road, a single 2-pounder, commanded by Sergeant Alan Hobson, destroyed 6 Panzers in less than 5 minutes before being silenced. When his crew was found later, the gun was still pointed at the enemy, the breech open, the next round half-loaded. The battlefield diary of a captured German lieutenant recorded, "The English gunners are mad. They fire until the tanks are upon them. They die beside their weapons, but they never run." The 2-pounder had limits, and everyone knew it. It couldn't fire high explosive shells, a bitter flaw that made it useless against infantry. Its armor penetration, once excellent, began to falter as newer German tanks arrived. The gunners adapted. They aimed for treads, turret rings, and vision slits. They used terrain, angles, and timing as part of their weapon. At night, they hauled the guns to new pits. In the morning, they fought again. The siege dragged on. The heat climbed above 45 degrees Celsius by day, plummeted at night, and the wind howled like an animal. Dust coated the skin like a second uniform. Men aged 10 years in months. Yet still, the guns fired. When the relief of Tobruk finally came in December 1941, the fortress was a ruin of stone and steel. Half the guns were gone, melted, shattered, or buried in the sand. But the line had held. The Afrika Korps had been stalled for 8 months, an eternity in desert warfare, and the myth of invincible German armor had been broken by the smallest gun on the battlefield. The British press turned Tobruk into legend, a story of courage that rallied the empire. But for the survivors, the memory was quieter. The smell of hot oil, the recoil of the breech, and the endless dust. One gunner wrote home, "You can have your tanks and bombers. I'll keep my little 2-pounder. It never let me down." In the grand arithmetic of the war, Tobruk was a delaying action. One fortress among many. But in the history of courage, it was something more. It proved that determination and discipline could turn weakness into strength. The men who manned the 2-pounders had no illusions. They knew they couldn't win the war from their gun pits, but they also knew that without them, the war might have been lost much sooner. And when the last shots echoed off the desert rocks and the smoke cleared, the wrecks of Rommel's Panzers stood as silent monuments to the gun that no one had wanted and the men who refused to abandon it.
The year 1942 began with a hard truth. The little gun that had once held the desert was now being outgrown by the war around it. The 2-pounder had proven its worth in Tobruk, yes, but Rommel had learned his lessons too. When the Desert Fox struck again in the spring of 1942, he brought with him not the same lightly armored Panzer III formations that had been torn apart the year before, but something new and terrible. The Panzer III J with thicker frontal plates, the Panzer IV F2 with a long 75mm cannon, and an army honed by a year of desert warfare. The battlefield that had once belonged to cunning and concealment was now ruled by range and firepower. And in that new order, the QF 2-pounder, small, loyal, and brave, was no longer the predator. It was prey. In May, during the Battle of Gazala, Rommel struck west of Tobruk with the confidence of a man who understood the desert better than anyone alive. His tanks swept through the soft sand in vast, coordinated arcs. The British and Commonwealth defenders, reorganized now as the 8th Army, were stronger, better equipped, but still stretched thin. They had new 6-pounder guns arriving by ship from Britain, but too few, too late. The bulk of the line still depended on the old 2-pounder. The gunners knew it. They didn't need a lecture in physics to understand what thicker armor and heavier guns meant. They could see it for themselves. Rounds that used to punch through the Panzers now sparked and ricocheted harmlessly away. The sound was unmistakable, the sharp, metallic clang of futility. Yet they fought on. One diary from the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment captured the change in tone. Quote, "The enemy is heavier now. We still use the 2 PDs. God help us if they see us first." Unquote. At Bir Hakeim in June 1942, the Free French and British anti-tank crews faced the full fury of the Afrika Korps. They fought for 16 days, encircled, under constant air attack. The little guns fired until the barrels warped. The crews dragged them from pit to pit, sometimes firing over open sights at tanks barely 100 yards away. A witness described the scene. Quote, "The 2-pounders looked like toys beside the German machines, but they fired until the sand turned black with oil and blood. When a gun was knocked out, the next crew crawled to it and used it again." Unquote. In those weeks, the desert became a furnace of courage and despair. For the gunners, every battle had become an act of defiance. They knew the odds. The 88mm flat guns, redeployed by Rommel as anti-tank weapons, could destroy a 2-pounder position from over a mile away. Stukas circled like hawks. And yet, time and again, the British line refused to collapse, because somewhere in the dust, behind a low ridge or a burned-out truck, there was always one more gun crew willing to fight until the barrel split. A gunner named Thomas Mitchell of the Royal Artillery wrote after the battle, quote, "You stop thinking of surviving. You just think of holding them a bit longer. One more tank, one more minute. Maybe that's enough." Unquote. That was the essence of the 2-pounder's final year. Heroism without hope, courage without illusion. By the summer of 1942, the 2-pounder was being replaced by the 6-pounder, 57mm, a heavier, more powerful weapon that could finally match the Panzers. But replacements arrived unevenly, and the old guns lingered. In some units, the crews mixed both weapons side by side, the young soldiers manning the new models, the veterans keeping their 2-pounders as if they were old friends. At El Alamein, the turning point of the North African campaign, the last major units still using the 2-pounder took their positions behind minefields and wire. They had learned the art of invisibility, how to vanish in the sand, how to fire and move, how to survive. When the Great Battle began in October 1942, they fired alongside their younger, stronger cousins. The first salvos from Rommel's tanks clanged off the front armor of the British lines. The desert lit up with tracer fire and smoke. The 2-pounder crews, many veterans of Tobruk, held their ground through it all. They knew this was the end. For the gun, for the campaign, perhaps even for them. A photograph taken that night shows the reality of their courage. A single 2-pounder stands alone on the flat sand, its barrel blackened, its carriage scorched. The caption reads simply, Gun position, El Alamein. Crew missing. The gun itself seems to lean slightly forward, as if still waiting for the next target. In truth, the 2-pounder had given everything it could. Its small shell could no longer pierce the new German armor. Its lack of explosive rounds made it useless for infantry. Even the mobility that once made it lethal was now a liability. Trucks mounting 2-pounders were shredded by 20mm autocannon fire before they could retreat. But no gun dies without purpose. The 2-pounder's sacrifice bought time, precious, irreplaceable time, for the 6-pounders to arrive in numbers, for Montgomery to reorganize the 8th Army, for the tide of the Desert War to turn. The soldiers who fired it understood this instinctively. They weren't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting to hold long enough for someone else to win. When Rommel was finally forced into retreat after El Alamein, the British press called it the end of the beginning. For the 2-pounder, it was simply the end. In the months that followed, most of the surviving guns were pulled from the line, scrapped, or relegated to training roles. Some were left behind in the desert, half buried in sand, the paint scorched off the sun. Others were mounted on trucks and used by Commonwealth patrols to chase retreating German convoys. But in every unit that had fought with them, the veterans remembered. They spoke of the gun not as a machine, but as a companion, the thing that had kept them alive when nothing else would. A letter from an Australian gunner to his family in Melbourne ended with a single line. "Our little gun's done her bit. She's tired, like us, but she never ran." By the end of 1942, the Desert War had changed. The 2-pounder was gone from the front lines, replaced by bigger, faster, louder weapons. But in the annals of the Royal Artillery, its record stood out not for the tanks it destroyed, but for the spirit it embodied. It was a weapon born of restraint, perfected by desperation, and sanctified by courage. Its story was proof that even the smallest tools in the hands of determined men can hold back giants. The 2-pounder had reached its limit, and in doing so, had revealed the limitless endurance of those who served it.
When the dust of North Africa finally settled in 1943, the 2-pounder was gone from the front lines. The war had moved on to Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, and so had the weapons. Bigger guns, thicker armor, faster tanks. Yet even as new steel rolled forward, the soldiers who had manned the little 40mm piece carried its memory with them. For them, the 2-pounder was not just a gun. It was the sound of the desert, the smell of burnt cordite in the morning, the weight of hope that came with each shell rammed home into the breach. When the 8th Army paraded through Tripoli after the Axis surrender in May 1943, rows of 6-pounders and 17-pounders gleamed in the sun. Behind them, on a flatbed truck, stood an old 2-pounder, pitted, sandblasted, and painted over a dozen times. Its shield was bent, its barrel scored from years of overfiring. On its breech, someone had chalked a single phrase: Tobruk's teeth. The men saluted as it passed. They didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Every veteran in that column knew what the little gun had done. After the desert campaigns ended, most of the surviving 2-pounders were shipped back to Britain or handed off to training units. Some went to India and Burma, where they were used against Japanese light tanks and bunkers. Others were scrapped quietly, their steel melted down to feed the next generation of armaments. But a few, a precious few, were kept intact. At the Royal Artillery Museum in Woolwich, curators placed one of the battered veterans from Tobruk on display. Its paint was faded, its trail scarred by shrapnel, and the breech still bore the faint white stencil: QF2PDR MK9 Vickers 1938. Visitors would pass by the great guns, the 25-pounders, the massive 17-pounder anti-tank pieces, the Mayville artillery, and stop in front of the small one, almost with surprise.
It looked too small to have changed the course of anything, yet the plaque beneath it told a different story. Used in the defensive Tobruk, 1941. This gun destroyed 9 enemy tanks before being disabled. Crew, all killed in action. Silence hung heavier than words. Years later, in post-war interviews, even German veterans spoke of it with respect. A former Panzer commander recalled, "The British had these small guns. You could not see them, you could not hear them until they fired. Then it was too late. You think they are dead, but they move, they shoot again. It was a nightmare." And in 1948, during a conversation with an Allied journalist, Erwin Rommel's former aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, made a simple admission. The British 2-pounder should not have been dangerous, but they made it dangerous. They turned toys into weapons. For the Commonwealth soldiers, especially the Australians who had borne the brunt of Tobruk, the gun became part of their identity. In RSL halls and veteran reunions, miniature 2-pounder shells were cast into commemorative badges. The Rats of Tobruk wore them with pride. At the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, one gun stands today under a pale desert light, recreated by the museum's designers. Its wheels are dusty, its muzzle painted matte black, and next to it sits a quote from Sergeant Bill Osborne, one of the original Tobruk gunners. "It wasn't the biggest gun or the loudest, but when you saw those tanks coming and you had one of these beside you, you didn't feel small anymore." In the grand industrial war that was World War II, it is easy to measure victory in tonnage and horsepower, in the massive engines of battleships, the roar of Spitfires, or the thunder of Sherman tanks. But the story of the 2-pounder reminds us that history often turns on things far smaller. It was a weapon built in an era of doubt, dismissed as obsolete before it ever fired a shot. And yet, in the most desperate year of the Desert War, it held the line when nothing else could. It turned dust and heat into defiance, and gave its crews something more powerful than steel: purpose. After the war, the 2-pounder's lineage did not vanish. Its lessons, compactness, mobility, precision, lived on in every lightweight anti-tank system that followed. The 6-pounder that replaced it carried its spirit into El Alamein. The 17-pounder that shattered Tigers in Normandy owed its existence to the engineers who first dared to imagine that a small, fast-firing gun could kill a tank. And even today, military historians trace a direct line from the 2-pounder to the portable anti-tank weapons of the modern age, from recoilless rifles to the shoulder-fired systems that soldiers carry now. The concept was the same: speed, surprise, survivability. But perhaps its greatest legacy lies not in metal, but in memory. Every war has its giants: the Yamato, the Tiger, the B-17, and every one of them begins as an idea in a designer's mind. The 2-pounder was the opposite. It was small because it had to be. It was built not to conquer, but to endure. And that, in the end, became its triumph. In an interview decades later, an elderly Australian veteran sat beside one of the last surviving guns, its paint flaking, its breech frozen forever, and he ran his hand along the cold metal and said softly, "She was never much to look at, but she was ours, and she never broke." Today, under the blinding lights of museum glass, the little gun that no one wanted stands silent. Its barrel still points slightly upward, as if waiting for one last target. Tourists pass by, glancing at its size, its rust, its age. Few linger. But for those who know the story, for those who can still hear the echo of battle in the desert wind, the message carved on the small brass plaque beneath it says it all. QF 2-pounder anti-tank gun, the weapon that held the desert. Small gun, big heart. And for the men who once fired it, that is how it will always be remembered.